This Real Agriculture podcast is brought to you by Genesis Fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizer is your farm's #1 expense. Farmers are working together through Genesis Fertilizers to solve the problem of high prices and security of supply by planting a state-of-the-art nitrogen plant. Security in earnings through ownership is the solution. Visit Genesis today at genesisfertilizers.com to learn more.
The Agronomists is brought to you by RealAg on the Weekend, the Soil School, and our own RealAg newsletters. Don't miss out on any of the content we publish. Whether you're looking for agronomy, current events, or industry news, our daily e-news will bring you our most current pieces every morning. Visit realagriculture.com/subscribe to get real and get connected with Real Agriculture. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and we are having way too much fun here behind the scenes and with everyone who's joined us here early. If anyone was on Twitter/X earlier today, you'll note that I shared the two most un-Canadian things about me. One, I can't stand Rush, the band, sorry, and also snowmobiling. So anyway, that would be why Jason Vogt is wondering, where is Rush? There will not be any Rush because we also can't afford the royalties. Okay, welcome to the show. A few things to cover tonight, a few more than usual. So one, welcome, of course, everyone on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, watching us, and also to everyone over at RFD TV Canada. So glad to have the show there as well. There is a slight change for all of you who collect CEU credits. So if you're a CCA, nothing changes for you. You still report through the website. But if you collect the CCSC, that's the Certified Crop Science Program, through the Certified Crop Science Program, if you collect them there, you're going to have to self-report. So don't worry, if you head on over to the website like you usually would, there will be an explanation there. But just keep in mind, you will have to self-report as opposed to submitting it through us. And I recommend taking a screenshot of tonight's broadcast and just have that because you're going to have to submit that as well. Okay, that covers that, I think. If there's anything else, Jay, you need to remind me of, please do. The one other thing I will say, if you have an off-CAF funding program with Ontario Soil and Crop, if you have a cover crop program and you need a knowledge sharing event, this broadcast counts for that, and we will have Margaret May's email at the end of the broadcast that you can email her and let her know you took this in. Okay, I feel like that was a lot of things to get through. So now we're actually going to start the show and bring in our guests to talk all about cover crops. We are here to challenge these two to answer your questions, and they've got some really cool data to share as well. So let's bring them in. We've got Peter Johnson with Real Agriculture and Yvonne Lawley at the University of Manitoba. Welcome here.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. It's always good to be here. Although I see Dave Hooker says the mega agronomist. Well,
the mega, yes.
Yeah, maybe Dr. Lawley is a mega agronomist. Maybe Lindsay has become a mega agronomist. Johnson is just no mega here, baby.
Oh, stop. Okay, so this is Pete. You haven't been on in a while. It's nice to have you back, so welcome here. I know you've been busy, so it's nice to have you front and center, of course. We are going to tackle the cover crop question from the East and the West, and what I'm really excited about is with all the data we have, we've got some really cool crossover between the two regions on how cover crops are used, and we're going to try tonight to quantify some of the benefits. And this is going to be one of the really cool parts of tonight, I think. So I will put that challenge out to the audience. If you've got questions about, species selection or termination, we will tackle all of those. But we are very much going to dig into some of the questions on the value of cover crops. So, Yvonne, I'll start with you. For looking at it through a prairie lens, through the Manitoba lens as well, what are the top benefits that farmers are looking for if they're considering using cover crops?
Well, just going over to the 2020 Prairie Cover Crop Survey, a lot of the benefits that farmers are looking for from cover crops relate to soil and soil management. So keeping the soil covered to keep that resource in place, trying to build soil carbon, trying to cycle nutrients, trying to feed microbes in soils.
Those are the top ones. Peter, how do you think that relates to Ontario? What do we know about what Ontario growers are trying to accomplish?
I think we're trying to accomplish the same things, but I think there's other things that we actually accomplish even better. The one in particular is weed control. And I mean, the whole allelopathy thing, cereal rye, the impact on Canada fleabane, like that to me is really where we're making massive gains. We also use it to fix nitrogen when we can manage to get red clover to establish. Or I think there's some innovative things we can look at as well after wheat to generate nitrogen. I'm really interested in, as much as I hate soybeans, maybe they make a good cover crop if they would cycle some nitrogen to the subsequent corn crop following there. And we haven't done much of that, but I think there's cool stuff there. Certainly the erosion, the soil tilth, the soil health thing, like we're all after it. Man, oh man, that is one that is just so hard to actually quantify or to put any dollar value on whatsoever. So anyway, we'll talk more about that. But weed control is the one big win that I think growers are starting to realize, and as probably as we get into more resistant weeds, very, very significant impact.
Yvonne, would you agree that are you seeing similar sort of outcomes of weed control or weed suppression being one of the benefits that you're seeing, or not as much in the West?
I think Manitoba is in a different place than Ontario in terms of the advancement of herbicide-resistant weeds. They're certainly here, and they're certainly on the move. But in my own experience in my research plots, I've put cover crops up against some resistant green foxtail, and they can't stand up to that green foxtail. So I think it depends what your weed is that you're dealing with. So it's great to hear from Peter that there's some weeds that these cover crops are standing up to in Ontario. I think if you just need something to occupy that space so that weed doesn't have that place to move in, like in my context, I'm thinking about kochia. Maybe cover crops can help with kochia, although I haven't looked at that in any of my research yet. But like where you've got a really competitive weeds, I don't think these cover crops are going to stand up to them. Maybe it's part of a strategy, but not the solution.
Yeah. So Pete, I mean, I think about some of the pretty phenomenal videos and photos we've seen of using something like rye to suppress, fleabane and those sorts of things. So it does seem to have a fit, but maybe not across the board necessarily.
Oh, absolutely. It's not across the board. And Mike Cobra did a super job at the Kemptville day of the Ontario Ag Conference last week. And he had some excellent slides. And all plants produce this BOA that is the allelopathic chemical. It's just how much of that they produce. And then you also have to look at, is the weed you're trying to suppress impacted significantly by that BOA? And so in the case of resistant foxtail, or in the case of foxtail, period, it probably just doesn't have that sensitivity. In the case of Canada fleabane, it absolutely does. The other thing, and this is one of the things on cover crops that we've really talked in Ontario, that when it comes to cover crop seeding rate, less is more, because we get too much of a mat, and then it's a real problem in terms of trying to deal with that matter residue. Boy, when it comes to weed control, the thicker the better. And so now we get into how do we balance weed control from a competition standpoint. And again, Mike has some pretty good data that 90% weed control out of a really aggressive cover crop canopy. So that's good. But if it causes us problems with residue management, then how do we marry those two different aspects together? And if there was an easy answer, then we wouldn't have to talk about it. So
well, Peter, there is an easy answer, but I didn't think I could bring in
no,
Chiefs
woolly
this
pigs
early
are
in the
not
conversation.
no woolly pigs. No, we are not going to woolly pigs.
Yes, they are. Anyway, okay. No, but it is part of this entire discussion. So if we're trying to keep soil where it should be, if we're trying to outcompete weeds, all of the things that we potentially are trying to accomplish with these cover crops, we do have to do exactly that, like think about that in between of What do we do with them if they do too well? So Yvonne, one of the things I was really surprised with, and we're going to look at some of the slides that you've submitted here to compare. I was sort of surprised by the comparison of how many cover crops were season long versus shoulder season. So to me, that just, how is that not just a crop? So maybe talk us through that comparison.
Yeah, no, this came out clearly in the prairie context of what cover crops are, and so when we were taking the prairie cover crop survey and adapting it for the Ontario cover crop feedback, we had to figure out the terminology of how we were going to relate between these two very different regions, like even just having this conversation. So in the prairies, I don't know if we want to put up, what's a good slide here?
Yeah, I was just going to say,
why don't we jump to slide number 1?
Okay. Well, yeah,
Starting
let's
at the
start at 1, start at the beginning and work our way through.
So yeah,
great
we
photo.
talked to 528 farmers for the 2020 prairie cover crop survey. 281 of those farmers were growing cover crops in 2020. And part of what I wanted to learn in this survey was just, what do farmers consider cover crops? And in my mind, I was thinking that I was going to be hearing from the farmers who are growing cover crops in the fall shoulder season after harvest. But 81% of the farmers who were early adopters, who were, chose to participate in this survey, 81% of those farmers were growing full season cover crops. So those are cover crops that are growing during the annual, during the cash crop growing season. And I think this is a terminology thing, right? So in the prairies, before there was cover crops, there were polycrops, and then cover crops came, and people called their polycrops cover crops because they were kind of going after the same thing, these really diverse mixtures that were largely being grazed or being grown for cover.
Because so are we talking about, if a farmer says that it's full, does that mean it's like underseeded to something else? Or would this be just an annual mix that would be grazed off or whatever?
That's being grown for some soil building purpose. So again, I don't know how, like in the Ontario cover crop feedback, we didn't really see this category come out loud and clear. Right. Whereas in the prairies, this was very much lumped. Now, I don't think you get an off-calf payment for cover crops for what farmers are calling full season cover crops. So as a researcher, I don't have to be bound by policy.
Right. You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
But there's definitely a prairie thing going on here about those wanting to grow diverse annual plant mixtures for a full season. Largely they're being grazed. Maybe the timing of grazing differs depending on the operation, but that's a part of the mix here.
See, Peter, people can graze things, and sometimes they don't use sheep, sometimes they use cattle. Okay, so but let's contrast that with Ontario. There are, I think, some hard lines between, so red clover, of course, Peter's favorite bestie. I mean, that's been around for a while, and adoption of that has been pretty good. Maybe not as good as you would like, Pete. But it's, hey, at least people knew, okay, we can put red clover down. But then I think about, some of the more common things. So I think about, oats going down, or an oat pea mixture or something like that after wheat. So can we say, Pete, that we have maybe some most common combinations or choices right now in Ontario?
Yeah, and I think the answer is absolutely. Red clover, as you point out, underseeded in either winter wheat or a spring cereal, when it catches, there clearly is about nothing better, because you can get great biomass, you get great nitrogen credit, but so many people don't get a good stand that we move to the annual cover crops. And the annual cover crops, the oat crop is always the base. And then it's just, do you add something to the oat crop? And the vast majority of acres, I'm pretty impressed. I think in a lot of Ontario now, 80% of the wheat stubble probably has a cover crop growing. And that's a big number compared to where we were 10 years ago, oh my gosh, like 10 years ago, if it was 25%, it was probably optimistic. And now I think it's 80%. So huge improvement. Oats the base, and then it's what you put with the oats.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody has a favorite. Like oats and a daikon radish is a fairly common blend. Cereal rye it is common if you're not going to corn, but I think most growers now cereal rye have just learned that's problematic if you're going to a corn crop, and so its use is maybe less than it could be. Oat pea, the problem with pea is it's expensive, and so it's cheaper to put daikon radish in that blend. I like a few sunflowers thrown in with the oats. It's just a perception thing, because then everybody out of London or Toronto or Barrie or wherever drive past and see these, that farmer's growing sunflowers, he's such a good farmer. All right, it doesn't make any difference at all. But anyway, if it makes people think we're doing the right thing, I want a few sunflowers, but just a few, because they can be a problem. If from a weed control standpoint, sometimes they can be a problem.
So Yvonne, you've got a slide on the species mix that farmers grow, and so to that point, Peter, as well as we go through this, I want to ask the question of both of you. Do you need that kitchen sink mix to get some of the benefits, or does just one or just two do it? So Yvonne, let's look at this first, and then I'll ask you both that question on. Yeah.
I think this slide is, telling a lot of the same story that Pete was just talking about, right? Like if we look at what farmers responded at our survey about what they were growing, we've got oats that are right up there. We've got clovers, and fall rye is a staple as well. There is some radish there. I mean, I think we got to talk about radish in a prairie context as well, and sort of the challenges that we have with flea beetles. And I think, like Pete was talking about, after wheat or after oats, anytime we have a cereal crop, we've got volunteers. And so thinking about how to augment the volunteers with something that's going to complement them is an important strategy in the prairies. Mm-hmm. If we go to the next slide, slide 7, we can also look at the number of species that people responded. And this data is broken out by grazers and not grazers. And there's a really interesting distribution here on the sort of the optimum number, or not the optimum, but what the real numbers are and what people are doing. You can see where you're not grazing. So grain farms probably doing a lot more acres. We see a lot more respondents growing 1, maybe 2 to 3 species, whereas those who are grazing are more likely to have something in the range of 2 to 3, all the way up to more diverse 6 or 7 way mixes. And I think that also comes back to like the opportunity to recoup some of the seed costs through grazing.
Mm-hmm. And Pete, as much as we might sort of make fun of the whole, hey, it looks pretty, there's 2 things to that. There is, let's face it, we farm in the public eye, and we are, we're growing food and we're taking care of a public good that is soil and water and air. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it being pretty to look at. Now, whether or not it adds anything to the benefits from the soil perspective is a question. So Pete, I'll ask you, do I need to put, let's say I'm not going to graze it, is there a benefit after wheat, let's say, of me putting in 6 species versus 2?
There's very little research that shows any benefit to more than a monoculture. And I don't know, we could go to some of Dave Hooker's more recent slides if you want, or we can save them for the whole story in a bit. But whether I look at Dave Hooker's research, whether I look at the stuff coming out of Maryland, man, there's very little research that says there's any additive benefit to speak of most years. And again, that means that we're growing something that is adapted to our region. If we grew sun hemp, for example, only in Ontario, yeah, probably you could get a benefit by adding something to the sun hemp, because sun hemp is not really adapted here. And when it gets cool in the fall, it pretty well shuts down. And so having some oats there, or some clover, or daikon radish, whatever, is going to fill in and still do some growth. And I think that growth helps from that perspective. The one thing I will mention, Lindsay, because you the pretty is good, and so phacelia is pretty. You can add phacelia as well. Any of that is good, but a couple of things. One, the first thing you really want to do with a cover crop is define what you want that cover crop to do. And so if I'm Ryan Barrett in Prince Edward Island and I've got wireworms that are eating my potatoes, then it's either brown mustard or it's buckwheat. And what's really interesting in that research is it looks like, if I recall correctly, you needed about 20% of the blend to be buckwheat to get that impact on wireworm and reduce your wireworm populations. If you don't have wireworm as a problem, buckwheat can be a heck of a weed problem, so why would I include it? Once a mustard grower, always a mustard grower, so why would I grow brown mustard? So you really have to define what the objective is, and I mean, that even comes with weed control, because cereal rye is the best, but it also impacts seeding rate. But in terms of the mixes, don't put a turnip in with your oats and your sunflowers. Because if you put a turnip in with your oats and your sunflowers, and the sunflowers head out and look beautiful, then the general public will stop and trespass into your field and cut the sunflowers to take them home and put them on the kitchen table. And the turnips will be, this big, and they'll step on the turnip and twist or break their ankle, and they'll sue you even though they're trespassing. So don't put both in.
Also, any of the brassicas when they're breaking down stink. We talked about this earlier today. So yes, there is absolutely that. Okay. We're going to, Producer Jay, if you would cue up the clip on. I'm glad you mentioned potatoes. So this is a clip from Profitable Practices of Using Cover Crops in Potato Rotation, because pretty hard on soil, let's face it, and wire. So we, and then after that, I do want to address, I'm frozen, that's okay. I want to work into this question of whether or not we actually are building soil, and then work that into the yield question. So Producer Jay, if you would, let's go to our clip on using cover crops in potatoes.
Sustainability is important as well. Our major processors are wanting to know what's our sustainability, what's our long-term plan, and cover crops are a major part of that as well.
What are some of the challenges you face growing potatoes here on the island?
So some of the challenges can be the extremes in the weather. The weather may predict 5 mils of rain, and we get 50 mils of rain. You just never know what's going to come at you tomorrow.
Andrew, tell us about your cover crop program. Give us the nuts and bolts.
So there's been a lot of research done on cover crops. We basically have been part of that research for the past maybe 10 years or so. So that's allowed us to been able to decide which cover crops are going to work. As far as timing, I know Ryan Bear with the Potato Board has developed numerous tables to work with to allow us to decide what cover crops to plant on what dates behind which crops to get the best value for the bucket of your cover crops. Here at Hilltop Produce, I guess you never know what tomorrow is going to bring. You try to put your best plan together is what you're going to do in the spring, and due to the extreme weather events, that plan can change very fast. For the most part, we plant some sorghum Sudan. We were going to detour from that path, but we stayed with it because of the high cost of inputs this spring. We feel the value is there. It helps to add to the soil health. We've also used some mustard. Wireworms are more and more of a part of what we have here on PEI, and mustard neutralizes that a bit. And also in the fall here, we've been doing some tillage radish as well, and we like to put in with our plow, as you can see here, and it seems to hold the soil together, eliminates the erosion, and it kind of helps to work the soil for the coming year of potatoes as well. Works up very nice, the tilth of the soil. It works well. as well whenever we're harvesting potatoes. To me, that's when I find a lot of the erosion can occur after the potatoes. It's a very intense crop on the soil, so we like to do some winter wheat and hopefully get it through for a cash crop the next year. As well, we like to spread some barley as well after we harvest the potatoes.
The Agronomist is brought to you by the RealAg newsletters, RealAg on the Weekend, and the Soil School. Soil health directly impacts crop health, which directly impacts your bottom line. RealAgriculture Soil School provides an opportunity for farmers to learn how to improve soil through discussions on the use of cover crops, strip till and no-till, compost, manure, and more. The Soil School is made possible by support from the Mosaic Company. Visit realagriculture.com/soil-school for more. I just love our little graphic of the agronomist going. Anyway, thank you, Jay. Thank you, producer Jay, for that. Okay, so in that clip, and one of the reasons I pulled it is that obviously very intense production on the potato side. A lot of work goes into that soil, into all the hilling, into the harvest. And so, interesting to see how potato growers are using cover crops in rotation to try and offset some of those practices. Let's dig into, because he did mention, of course, the soil tilth, which I don't know about you, but that word irks me just a little because I don't know. I know what it means like in practice, but I don't know what it means scientifically. So let's talk about how we can measure the value of cover crops to soil. Maybe we'll start there. So Yvonne, what are some of the ways your work has tried to measure the benefits to the soil itself in using cover crops in rotation?
We've been trying a lot of things. I think we got to go back to where Pete was on your goals, right? So what are your goals? That defines what metrics matter. I think that yield is a good goal, but it could take some time. And a lot of my studies right now on the prairies, my goal is just do no harm, right? If we include cover crops in our rotation, do we not limit the yield of our next cash crop, especially thinking about dryness? I think the other measures that really matter for me are trafficability. And that I have not found a good way to measure yet. I'm collaborating with a new soil scientist that we have at the U of M, Afua Monte, and I'm really excited to get some of her time and attention on trafficability with cover crops, especially with rye. It hasn't been really wet in the springtime here, but it will be wet in the springtime again. And we're going to want that trafficability then. I think the other measure that really matters, and Afu and I are going to be working on, is infiltration. So in this dry time, how can we have soil structure that allows us to keep soil pores open, and when that water infiltrates, to move that water into a meaningful place in our soil profile. I've been collaborating with Kate Congreves, and we've also been sending soil to her to look at the new index that she's developing based on the Cornell Soil Health Test, the Saskatchewan Soil Index. And so we're looking at how to calibrate, or she's looking at how to calibrate, and we're seeing if we can measure any differences in the cover crop treatments that we have in our on-farm and small plot experiments. We haven't really moved the needle in that index, with the exception of potentially mineralizable nitrogen. Through these really dry years, we've had pretty limited biomass production from cover crops on the prairies. So measuring a lot of things, but when you don't grow a lot of cover crops because it's dry, there's not a lot to find.
It's really hard. So 2 points on that, exactly that. The West is up against limited moisture, in some cases none, and also a shorter season quite a bit in some areas, maybe not as much in some others, depending. Certainly there's been some anomalies in the past couple of years of nice open fall, etc.
Yeah.
So there's that. Also, Peter's favorite thing, tile drainage, not a thing for the most part across the West. So when we're talking about water infiltration, there is an incredible reason for wanting to focus on that, in that we don't have tile drainage for the most part in Western Canada, not to any huge degree. So really key points. Peter, you got to get in here. And I know you've got slides you want to share that
Yeah.
tackle this question. So
Go after them.
the floor is
Lindsay,
yours.
I just like you make it sound like infiltration doesn't matter in Ontario. It matters huge in Ontario because we really need that infiltration when we get those summer rainfalls that can often be really intense. And so if you don't have good infiltration, one of the really interesting things out of some of the rotation work that Dr. Amelie Gaudin has pulled together from University of California, Davis is that rotation improves the water status of the plants where you have a good rotation with cereals in rotation. They can't tie it to organic matter. They think it might be nitrogen related. Like there's some things that it could be. But the one thing they do know is that when they have the cereal in the rotation, they improve infiltration. And that infiltration matters not only in Western Canada, but it matters huge in Ontario as well, right? And so you mentioned tilth, and that bothers you, Lindsay. You know the word that bothers me, and it was in the video. Sustainability. What the heck is sustainability? Give me a break. Nobody can define sustainability. It drives me nuts. So anyway, we need to be sustainable, but sustainability, and even Friday at the Waterloo Ag Conference, the MWAC day, the one speaker talked about regenerative agriculture, and that meant reduced or no synthetic inputs. And I'm going, how does that make a soil regenerative? Because if I don't have sufficient phosphorus for the crop to grow, anyway, I'll get off that. So Jay, maybe if you could go to slide 5 rather than this one. This is the organic matter, and I think that we can talk about organic matter.
We'll probably come back to that one. Yeah, I'm just going to quote, or I'm just going to say, Pete, on the sustainability front, I think lots of people can define it. And that's perhaps the problem, is we don't always necessarily have an agreed upon definition. And so we can turn it into whatever we want. Anyway, now I'll jump off my soapbox and let's talk about soil health ratings.
Yep. And so sustainability, Colin Chappell from the UK said, take control of the narrative. And we're not doing that. And we need to. Anyway, so this is actually some of Shane and my data. And there's way too much data, so I put the yellow box at the bottom. That's what you need to focus on. So we were trying to measure the improvement in soil health parameters. So all the treatments on the left-hand side have some impact or is a soil health measurement of some nature. And after 6 years, so the no cover meant we tilled it if the grower wanted to. It was just a corn soybean wheat rotation, nothing special. And at the end of the day, the best management practice was cover crop after wheat only. The plant green, we kept green roots, living roots there the whole 6 years. We actually did it for 8 years, but I couldn't find that data on short notice. But at the end of even 8 years, in all those soil health measurements, we couldn't find anything. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a soil health benefit, but what it really means is that we haven't figured out how to measure it yet. And so it's hard to put a parameter on that soil health impact. And
can I just hop in quickly? Do you agree then with Yvonne's, first do no harm kind of thinking of putting that lens on some of this?
Oh, absolutely. So I don't know if we go to some of Dave Hooker's more recent research. So if you go to slide 10, Jay.
I have to check if it's on my list of if I wanted to talk about it, but you're clear. Go ahead.
Yowzers!
Carry on. No, it's my show.
This, by the way, is new data from I can't remember the other researchers. Laura Van Oort is one, and I can't remember. University of Guelph has. Dave will put it in the chat, I'm sure. Yeah, but Dave sent these slides, and so do no harm. We look at this, and it really is about, can we gain anything in yield, and realistically, whether it's a 3-way mix, a 10-way mix, straight oats, there's no difference. Here, the red clover, and it's again because they put full rate nitrogen on, the red clover is only about a 5 bushel, not statistically different whatsoever. Typically, red clover is kind of in that 8 bushel yield increase. But when you say do no harm, man, if we go to slide 9 now, Jay, I think, yeah, slide 9. So here we are. Talk about doing no harm. So we look at the oat situation, and if I grow oats without, oh, this is biomass. Sorry, I told you the wrong one, Jay. Dry matter. Where's the yield? Oh yeah. So if you go actually to slide 11, that's showing the
One
yield.
forward, not one back. There we go.
Yeah, my apologies. So again, this is huge data in my opinion, and thanks to Dr. Dave for doing it. Like, wow. So you look at the no cover, and the no cover, with or without some nitrogen doesn't really matter because there's nothing to take it up. You look at red clover, and red clover gives us this massive boost in yield without nitrogen. But notice the oat data. Like, we're actually statistically significantly hurting yield by growing oats after a wheat crop, oat as a cover crop, no applied nitrogen in the fall on that oat cover crop. And it's only 6 bushels, but it's so consistent that is a statistically significant yield drop. If we put 50 pounds of nitrogen on the oats in the fall so that we get better biomass production, and we change the carbon to nitrogen ratio in that biomass, now I don't get a yield drag. I actually get a 9 bushel yield gain over the no cover. And so when it comes to cover crop management and do no harm, Yvonne, this shows that if I just grow oats and I don't manage them appropriately, man, I can actually do harm. And similarly with cover crop rye, we know we can do harm to a corn crop, not so much to a soybean crop. So you start with do no harm, and then you start to look at ways that you can actually increase yield. And so I find this really amazing data. This is some of the first data that is actually showing a significant yield increase. Now, again, it disappears with full nitrogen, so you have to be a little cautious from that perspective. But this is pretty impactful stuff from trying to manage that cover crop appropriately.
Now, and this is, of course, oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, Yvonne, go ahead.
Speaks to the benefit of doing research and starting to think out of the box, right? Thinking about management of cover crops, right? Like we think, oh, we just put it out there, it grows, it does magic. But how can we take this practice or this concept and utilize it in our regions and adapt it to our regions? And this is where it's going to take agronomists working hard, making important observations so that we can dial these practices into our regions, into our rotations, and figure out what works. And then maybe we can push beyond the do no harm goal that I have right now, where we can really be pushing some of these metrics forward, or at least bringing stability and finding reliable practices.
Right. And that's what I think is really stunning about research like this is starting to tease out some of those answers of what is a management practice that likely has to happen in order for there not to be yield drag or those sorts of things. Because I do know in the farmers that I've spoken with and some of the farmers that I work with, that is one of their concerns is they want to keep their soil covered. They want the benefit of outcompeting weeds or that fall cover, but they don't want to tie up nutrients for next year. They want to make sure that they're still setting up their crop for top yield potential. So, and so, I mean, we're anticipating that this is a concern and we have to address that. Pete?
Management. If you don't kill the red clover, you will not see that yield gain. The red clover will be a weed, and we've seen this in that trial I showed earlier with the 8 years of data. We had red clover in at one site. They didn't get good fall kill, and we lost yield with the red clover there because it was a weed control impact. It wasn't really the root benefit, the soil benefit, the nitrogen benefit that we were after, just because we did harm because we didn't keep the full package of management in place. It's really interesting. Lee Breeze at MWAC on Friday, he said, when you start using cover crops, it's just like learning to play a musical instrument or learning how to do tillage right. You have to learn how to do the management that goes along with that cover crop. And until you learn that management and perfect that management, you can do harm, or you won't see the potential total benefit that is actually out there. And I see Dave put in the chat, it's Manish Razada that is, I think, leading the charge here.
Yes,
really
thank
cool
you.
stuff.
Yeah, and I will say also, Lee, Burn Tobin did an interview with Lee from his chat as Lee is making the round. So that discussion on cover crop management is on realagriculture.com and on our YouTube channel if you want to head over there. Now, Dr. Dave Hooker, who is in the chat, has a question. And I'm going to open this up, but we'll start with Yvonne. With limited moisture environments or years of limited moisture, is that the biggest holdback, do you think, to cover crop adoption? Or have farmers identified other reasons they maybe don't want to do it or don't want to do it again?
For prairie context?
Yes, prairie context.
Moisture is our biggest limitation to adoption in my mind right now. It's what I'm thinking about. You talked about growing season length and you talked about, limited moisture. If we are planting cover crops in the fall after harvest and there's no moisture to germinate that cover crop, there's no cover crop. And so reliable moisture in the fall is an issue. I've started looking at intercropping because that came out of the Prairie Cover Crop Survey as a strategy that prairie farmers were using to try and get something growing ahead of that moisture deficit that we commonly have in the fall at harvest time. I also think just, we've only got so much water to go around. This winter, we don't have a lot of snow on the prairie, so we got to think strategically about when we're going to have that biomass. And we got to be ready. I was talking with a farmer just this afternoon, and he was saying, it's dry right now, but it might not be dry next season. It might not be dry next, in 2 months. And so I think in a prairie context, hedging your bets and being ready is important. We know that we can grow the biomass when we have the moisture. But in these dry times right now, this is a difficult time to utilize this practice. I think we've got to utilize our other tools in the soil building toolbox, like managing residue to try and capture snow, figuring out equipment ways to spread straw and to keep soil in place with residue that already exists. And then maybe in zones in our field where we have problem soils or where we have moisture or fields that are wet, those are the ones to start with right now when it's dry on the prairies.
Yvonne, it's a really good point of expanding the idea of outside of, okay, so if we're not going to start a new crop, what can we do with the existing crop that we've got to potentially help out with that snow trapping, etc. Peter also likes snow trapping because it helps his winter wheat survive. So at least we can sing kumbaya on that one. Okay, Dave has answered the one question. Nick wanted to know, welcome here, Nick. It's okay to be late to this party. What was in the 3-way and the 10-way mix? So Dr. Dave has shared the 3-way mix was tillage radish, oat, and crimson clover, and 10-way was basically everything else you can fit in there. So that's one of those kitchen sink mixes. Name 10 plants. They were probably in there. So there you go. But that's what was in the 3-way conversation. Okay, just quickly, we're going to throw to our last sponsor read of the night, and then we're going to come back and talk a bit more about the soil building that we want to do with our use of cover crops. The Agronomist is brought to you by The Soil School, RealAg Newsletters, and RealAg on the Weekend. In partnership with Bronco Radio, Real Agriculture is pleased to present RealAg on the Weekend with host Sean Haney. Listen live on Saturdays at 4 p.m. on 650 CKOM Saskatoon and 980 CJME Regina, or find it on Real Agriculture, RealAg's podcast feed, or on CJME.com and CKOM.com as a podcast download. Okay, so great question from Andy. And then I've got some slides from Yvonne that I've scribbled down that I absolutely need to get to because there's some really interesting spots on there I want to talk about. But Andy says, and Pete, I'll put this to you. If we apply 50 pounds of N on the oats, can we reduce in season N on the following corn crop? Dun, dun, dun.
And so I think there's two parts of that. One is it will depend on when the oats release that nitrogen. And I think some years you will be able to, and some years you won't, depending on just how mature the oats got in the fall. And so I really think, Andy, we have to come back and we have to say, okay, we're going to do a soil nitrate test, a side dress N test at 6-leaf corn, because I don't know how else to tell that. And the other thing I would say is that it looks like if we put that 50 pounds of N on the oat crop, that we get 9 bushels more yield. The 9 bushels more yield actually will pay for the 50 pounds of nitrogen. So if that relationship holds up, and we'd have to think a bit more about that in terms of, can we make that real? But if I can get better oat growth, more biomass from the oats, I also am more resistant to rust in the oat crop. We've seen that where we didn't put nitrogen on the oat crop. It was just stripe rust from, out the yin yang. Where we put the nitrogen on, it made the plant healthy enough that it was able to tolerate that rust infestation a little bit better. And so I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why you would put the 50 pounds of nitrogen there and give it a go. But the best way to do it by far is just make a deal with your woolly pig farmer next door and steal their manure and go spread that on and get the nitrogen that way if you can at all.
You don't even have to steal it. We give it freely. We don't collect it at all. They just leave it there and it just stays. We don't need it. No, it is. So I will share. And certainly this is happening in Ontario and Yvonne. I mean, I would say there's more of these connections maybe for Western Canada because some of these crops are grown to be grazed. But one of the big drivers for us bringing our sheep to other farmers' cover crops is that they're worried about the tie-up. They're worried about that much biomass. They don't want to till significantly, but they want to get those nutrient cycling, and they don't want to necessarily have that yield penalty the next year. And so that's where they're using livestock to speed that process along. So, okay, so with the time we have left, this is probably the fastest show in a long time because there's so much to cover. Yvonne, I think it's your slide. I want to say it's slide 23. And there's a few before that I want to go to as well. But producer Jay, if you could bring up slide 23, there's a few things on here. So challenges of fall seeded crops. So we talked about moisture limiting, but I want everybody to maybe look at the purple on there where it says destroyed by flea beetles. And no emergent. Okay, so walk us through, because oh man, that stings. For sure.
It's why that was important species to test. So this was an experiment done by my graduate student, Virginia Jansen, over 4 site years from 2018 to 2020 at 2 locations. And we looked at, a range of cool season, a few warm season species like sorghum, sudan, and soybeans. And radish was among the cool season species that we test. So I love radish. I'm the biggest radish supporter. But in the prairies where we grow a lot of canola, we've got a lot of flea beetles, and they are ravenously hungry when it's time to swath canola. So we were doing a planting date study with our early treatment was August 15th, our mid treatment was September 1, and our late treatment was September 15th. And, there's just a lot of flea beetles in the fall, and they can absolutely devour your radish in cover crops, either as a monoculture. You can hide them a little bit in a mixture, but they'll find them if they're there eventually, if they're hungry enough. So radish was a difficult species. Pete was talking about soybean, and I was also really interested in soybean because, you've got seed left over. It can fix nitrogen. And so it was also sort of a toughie, just depending upon how early you could plant it. So we had good emergence when we seeded it early, and then when it gets to be mid-September, it's hard for it to come up. So, and then sorghum sudan was also kind of an iffy one because of the early frost that we have, and just doesn't stick around long enough if we're planting after harvest. So if you're doing a late summer cover, or you're planting an annual forage or full season cover through the summer, hey, that's a great species to put in there. But if you're just planting later in the fall, you can get more biomass out of probably your volunteer wheat or oats or barley or something like that for grasses.
Now, Pete, the question of volunteer wheat does come up every year. So what's the difference? Is there a difference if I just let the volunteers and I just is that not a cover crop? Why or why not?
And so if you can spread the wheat uniformly, if you have good chaff spreader that you actually can spread, and you can't, by the way, but if you could, because silly people are getting 55 and 60-foot headers, and you just can't spread the wheat that far.
No.
The difference with wheat versus oat is that wheat has to be vernalized, right? It's a winter annual. It needs vernalization. It will never grow much above ground biomass. If all I want is roots, man, you can get a mass of roots out of volunteer winter wheat if you can actually get volunteer winter wheat uniformly spread across the whole field. But you're never going to get the same level of weed control, weed suppression, just because it stays short. And you're not going to get the same amount of above ground biomass, again, because oats will shoot to head. And so they're going to give you sometimes 5,000 kilograms per hectare of above ground biomass, whereas wheat is probably never going to break much above 800 kilograms if you're really lucky.
Now, I will note that was for the Ontario context, not for the Western context. For the Western context, it might be the only thing growing, so give her. And we can talk about why that matters in just a moment, except for Russ has a great question. So Russ asks, and Yvonne, this is for you, but it plays into some of the questions we have in the East as well about pathogens and about the green bridge, about diseases. So are we worried, like clubroot, Phantomyces, some of these that brassicas or pulse crops need and love, are we worried about including some in rotation? Could that potentially spread or keep some of these pathogens around or make them worse if we've got these species in our cover crop mixes?
Cover crops are no different than crops. You got to manage for diseases, and you got to manage that green bridge. If you're worried about it, you've got to manage for it. So yes, it's real. There's no magic bullet here. You've got to, if you're worried about clubroot, you got to make sure that your cover crop mix is clubroot compatible. And I think that's where we need some data, right? We need some screening for cover crops, especially for the West. We don't have that right now, but we're going to need it soon.
And I'll just add to that, Lindsay. From a soybean standpoint, soybean cyst nematode, huge concern. And so we already grow too many soybeans. So I'm reluctant to put more soybeans in the rotation, but I'm really interested in terms of how much nitrogen they maybe could contribute to the subsequent corn crop. And I just don't think, I haven't seen that data at least. So I still want to look at it, even though I think that's a really valid comment that Russ has. And again, like, what are you after? I expect that growing brown mustard might well have an impact on clubroot, or I'm not sure of that, but I expect it crosses. They're both brassicas. But if I have wireworms, then I want to do it. So yeah.
Which is the bigger issue, or which is the bigger risk, right?
Right.
So we got to look at, we're trying to factor in a lot of things like cost of seed, how we're going to seed the cover crop. And then another layer is certainly thinking about disease, insects, and green bridge, those sorts of issues. And so you've got to make some informed decisions. And that's why agronomists are important in being there to support farmers as they move into this new practice.
You just made Pete's whole night.
All here.
That and we talked about clover on wheat. Okay, so one of the things I want to dig into a little bit now, though, and we don't have a ton of time, but definitely and we've talked a bit about trying to measure some of the soil health benefits. We've got the development, and we're trying to figure out what we can potentially measure in our soil. So a few of the things we can measure and we can compare are things like soil organic matter. We can measure that. We can measure different rates of different nutrients. Pete, I'll start with you. There was a time not long ago, it was, roots, not iron. And now it's like, we need living roots, we need biomass, we need, plant growth. How has that shifted? What do we sort of better understand, and what do we still want to better understand on the living root system and soil health?
Yeah, and so maybe if Jay could pull up slide 3, I think that will help us a whole lot. And it's a little bit of a complex slide, but it really does drive home this whole new understanding of organic matter. And I mean, we haven't really been able to tie organic matter directly to soil health, but man, if that's not part of the holy grail, I don't know what is. And what's really interesting about this research is that we now know that it's not just the residues, it's not just the root residues, the above ground shoot residues, but it's actually the root exudates. And depending on the plant, up to 50% of the carbohydrate can go as root exudates. And we knew that the biology fed on those, but we did not realize that as they died, they could actually turn that into organic matter. It's the MAOM, which is mineral associated organic matter. The POM is particulate, and that's really what we thought was coming out of the residue itself. But this living roots and root exudates, up to 5 times more soil organic matter produced than the above ground part of the plant. And so when you ask me about wheat, volunteer wheat as a cover crop, well, as long as it grows a super root system, maybe it is as good as oat that grows the more biomass above ground. But I don't think we've been able to really, sort that out. I will say that you put oat in, and I see that Rye said monocrop brassicas are not good for soil health. Well, I think it depends on what you're trying to do with that soil health, because monocrop brown mustard is good for wireworm control. But when we look at following an oat crop, and grasses in general seem to do a little bit more of this improvement than broadleaves, in terms of how we have an impact on soil organic matter. And you grow something after an oat crop. My great friend Rob Templeman, wheat with oat cover crop, and he grows soybeans after that versus growing them after corn, and consistently a 6 bushel yield increase to growing the soybean after wheat with an oat cover crop. And it's just all about the tilth of that soil. As much as you hate that term, Lindsay, because we can't, but I know, like, if you plow that, as much as I hate the moldboard plow, you hit where you have the oats and you'll go a gear faster, and it just plows and turns to ashes because it's got such nice structure, such nice tilth. And that organic matter, this is the new finding from an organic matter standpoint.
Yeah. Okay. There's many things I could argue with you about on that one. But it's because you triggered me with the word plow. So we're just going to move on from that for a minute, because no one needs to see me go off about these things. But Yvonne, so building on this though, from your research, what are some of these, either organic matter or the things that we can measure or are trying to measure in differences as far as what the roots and exudates and all these things add to our soil?
Okay, that's a lot.
It is.
One thing that we haven't talked about tonight that I think is a really good integrator is aggregate stability. And yeah, we can be really technical about it in a lab, but you can go get an aggregate and put it in some water and see how it stands up to a slake test. And I think that's a really good indicator of where you're at and how you're doing when you're looking at aggregate stability. You can go and get a lab test for active carbon or epoxy, depending upon what lab you're working with. And, you talked about the importance of organic matter, right? That total carbon pool. And that's why we've got this new OCHAC program to try and, build soil carbon. But I have no data right now on the prairie showing that my fall cover crops are moving the needle. The needle I'm watching for right now is that more active pool of carbon to see if I can move that active carbon pool to see if it'll be a leading indicator. Again, coming back to doing no harm. In the prairies, we have these rich young soils with a lot of organic matter. And so if we can implement practices that preserve the organic matter that we have, I think we're doing well. And we got to think about where in our landscapes we need to preserve that organic matter and where we need to build it the most. So maybe some site-specific management is also an approach that we can take on the prairies when we're looking at some of these soil health goals. Mm-hmm. I think also just looking at your root structure. So it's not an easy test to do. But you know where the good areas and the bad areas are within your fields or your clients that you're working with. Know those areas. Going out with a shovel and looking at root structure. Pete was talking about the importance of roots and root exudates to cement that organic matter into the soil and build structure. Go take a look at that structure. Go take a look for those films around roots to see if those tiny little cover crops that maybe have a lot more root than we appreciate in the fall, to see if they've got those films of soil clinging to them, because that is that rhizosphere where all that activity is happening.
I love it so much. And you know what, Pete, you can do it with a shovel. You don't need to do it with a plow. So anyway, just throwing it out there.
Yeah. So just so you know, Lindsay, plow is a 4-letter word. Okay.
That's right.
And so
it is.
You should never use 4-letter words. So I am not a plow.
I know
advocate,
you're not.
But anyway.
I know. But yeah. Go ahead.
One of the practices, I don't want to be, and I'm also not that pro-tillage person, but I live and work in the Red River Valley where it's all around me, and so trying to find some compromise. I think it's important to talk about strategic tillage with cover crops, and one of the projects I did was looking at using strip tillage in fall rye cover crops. I think, Pete, at the very beginning you were talking about sort of the trade-offs between having this big biomass crop. So maybe using strategic tillage is actually a way to get us into those big biomass crops where we're not afraid of that big biomass.
Yeah, I love the strip tiller, by the way. I strip till myself. I think it's a really good compromise of trying to have big biomass and not have it beat you over the head. And so, I'm bang on with that from that perspective.
And it keeps the people that feel they have to drive their tractors and have to work. No, they feel good. They got to go do it, Pete. They got to get out there and turn something, and they're super happy about it.
And it takes power, man. If you use a shank machine, you can pour black smoke, and every farmer loves black smoke.
Oh, I'm gonna barf. Anyway, but I mean, to that point, and I'm somewhat kidding, but only a little bit. But realistically, it is really important that some tillage or tillage for the right reasons, or depending on the type of tillage, can be just an incredible tool for getting you where you want to be. But it's first do no harm. So there you go. Okay, I did promise that we would share the information for the off-calf funding. So we have mentioned that, of course. So if you're looking for that email address that's on your screen, mmay@ontariosoilcrop.org, that is Margaret May's email. Let her know that you watch the program, and she will get you all sorted out to make sure you get that knowledge sharing event, that KSE. And if you have any trouble, of course, you can just email me, lsmith@realagriculture.com. We'll get you connected and all those sorts of good things. Okay, we could go on for another hour, but I'm pretty sure all y'all have lives. So I thank you very much. I do want to send a shout out. So Dr. Dave Hooker, who's in the chat, he's going to be here in 2 weeks talking about the power of rotation. And a lot of this conversation sort of feeds into that one. So he'll be sharing, I'm sure, some of that data as well. He's going to be joined by Dr. Bobby Helgeson at the University of Saskatchewan. So she's going to bring the microbiology to the discussion as well. And next week, we've got Greg Stewart and Ryan Bonnet. They're going to go head to head on biologicals. So biological products, what we know, and all those sorts of good things. So we've got a couple good shows in a row, you guys. I'm pretty excited about this. So Yvonne, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Happy to.
Pete, I guess it was okay. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much, Pete, for sharing. This actually, if you must know, everyone, Pete planned this episode, I think, 2 months ago. he was like, Lindsay, we need to put this on the calendar and we have to talk about this. So, and I agreed. So here we are, and it has been fantastic. So thank you. Thank you, of course, to everyone in the chat as well. Thank you for asking your questions. Yvonne, you've got, I think it's slide 32. If you would put up slide 32. We were talking earlier today about the usefulness of QR codes. And that is probably the prettiest QR code I've ever seen, Yvonne. So
that is the
I
power
mean,
of graduate
it's amazing.
students. They do amazing things like make beautiful QR codes
Make
and teach me about
beautiful
it.
QR codes. Yeah, so there you go. Who knew yes, what we could do with QR codes, but they can be that pretty. So there you go. If you're looking for more resources, you can follow those along. Thank you, everyone. Of course, we'll be back next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on The Agronomist. Thank you, of course, to our show sponsors as well. And we'll see you next week, everybody. Cheers.